some people have noted that this is a conference about not just pragmatism in philosophy of science, but pragmatism and causation in philosophy of science. And given those themes, there's no one better to have as a speaker than Jim Woodward. So anybody who hasn't read Making Things Happen, which is almost 20 years old now?
It's a little older than that,
Yeah.
I think, 21.
Yeah, go out and read it now, all you graduate students. It's a terrific book, and Jim has continued to publish on issues in causation and explanation throughout his career. So it's a terrific treat to have him here as the final speaker today, and he'll talk about the place of explanation.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Chris, and this has been a wonderful conference. I really have enjoyed being here, and I just want to say thanks to the organizers and to all else who have been involved. I entitled this talk "The Place of Explanation," and it's a very much a kind of big picture talk. You'll see that there are lots and lots of loose ends. It's a work in progress, or maybe in regress, and I'd be very grateful for, any kind of pushback or particularly suggestions about how, if possible, to make things clearer. So here's the general outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about explanation as a goal of science. It functions, I think, to direct inquiry. That's one useful thing that goals can do. I'm going to say a little bit about a certain picture of explanation that I have, which I've called the "what if things had been different" conception of explanation. I'm going to argue against inference to the so-called inference to the best explanation as a valid inference form. And I'm going to suggest that, at least ideally, what we want to aim at is inference to the only explanation. And then I hope the time will permit, I'll say a little bit about the implications of this for scientific realism. So I think, as I said, of explanation as a goal of science. There's a tendency among people who are scientific realists to think of truth and only truth as a goal of science. I am a kind of realist, a sort of tempered realist, but I don't think that the idea that truth is the only goal of science is an adequate way of understanding science. And the basic reason for this is that, at least as I understand it, scientists don't just care about discovering truth, they care about discovering particular kinds of truths. And among the particular kinds of truths that they aim at discovering are truths that can figure in explanation. So we need the notion of a goal like explanation as a way of sort of directing inquiry in specific directions. Truth by itself is insufficiently directive, in my view. Now, here in a side about truth, I'm going to use this word in what follows, but it's really not a great description of what I have in mind. I don't have a better word, really. What I mean here when I talk about truth or truth-likeness is something like accurate or correct within some domain, or maybe a good approximation. And I'm happy to describe merely effective theories as truth-like within their domain of application. And the reason that I'm interested in what I will mean by how to understand the notion of truth and what commitments it carries with it with respect to explanation is I think that explanations have to satisfy some kind of truth requirement, but a truth requirement that is somewhat weaker than many philosophers suppose. And in particular, I think what really matters for successful explanation is that the so-called dependency relations, and I'll say more in a minute about what that means, have to be truth-like. The other parts of the explanation don't necessarily have to be truth-like. So I already mentioned this idea that truth in general is, I think, insufficiently discriminating to give us an accurate characterization of the only goal of science. I might produce extremely accurate descriptions of the positions of all of the leaves in Shenley Park in Pittsburgh on a certain afternoon. Lots of truths there, but at least in ordinary context, not the sort of thing that science aims at discovering. And I think it's at this point that we have to bring other goals into the picture. For example, one such goal is prediction. We want predictions that are true or true enough. And I think finding explanations is another such goal. It's of course distinct from prediction for reasons that should be familiar. So my idea is that there is a connection between truth likeness and explanation, but it's not the case that we value explanatoriness or potential explanatoriness just because it's in some way a means to discovering truth. Rather, finding explanations is a goal in its own right. And I think that thinking of science in this way as having among its goals, and as I've already suggested, I don't by any means want to suggest that the only goal or aim in science is finding explanation. I think finding explanations. I think this helps us to make sense of various features of scientific practice. So just to give one example, consider the introduction of so-called unobservables into a scientific theory. Why do we do this? Well, I think we do this at least in part because of our explanatory goals. We might discover that no relationships among so-called observables are sufficient to explain some pattern of behavior. And so, if we can get enough evidence of the right sort, and I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, we end up being driven to postulate so-called unobservables to explain the behavior in question. So a simple example is Brownian motion. Very, very careful experiments in the 19th century showed that none of the obvious observable causes were adequate to explain the behavior of that pollen grain or whatever that was getting knocked around, and it was eventually concluded that the movement of that pollen grain was due to the impact of molecules which were unobservable. So this is a case of an explanatory consideration. We don't just say, well, the pollen grain moves around, but who knows why? That's not any proper business of science. Instead, we look for an explanation, and sometimes the explanation drives us to unobservables. So, as I've been trying to emphasize, explanation involves certain kinds of commitment to truths, but it has to do with the discovery of particular kinds of truths. So, let me say now a little bit about what I mean by explanation. This is an idea that I've defended elsewhere. The basic idea, I call this the what if things had been different, or W account of explanation. The basic idea is that we explain an outcome by locating it within a space of possibilities. In particular, we look for conditions such that if those conditions had been different, the outcome in question would have been different, and such that those conditions had been different in some other way, the outcome in question might have been the same. So we're looking for what I call dependency relations. We're trying to answer questions about what would happen to this phenomenon if these explanatory factors were to change in various ways. And so Newtonian mechanics furnishes some simple examples. If we're interested in explaining the trajectory of a planet, if its mass or its distance from the sun had been different, it would have followed a different trajectory, et cetera, et cetera. The role of these dependency relations in understanding Newtonian mechanics has been particularly emphasized by Bill Harper and other work, and that's, I think, an important theme in George Smith's work on understanding Newton's methodology. Causal explanations are one kind of explanation that satisfies this W condition account, but I think it's entirely possible or arguable that there are non-causal forms of explanation. So I'm not going to assume in what follows that we're limited purely to causal explanations. The W account of explanation, in the sense that I'm going to try to make clear, is what might be thought of as a minimalist account of explanation. And I'll try to, as I say, I'll try to explain more about what I mean by this shortly. But in particular, it doesn't require that explanations have certain virtues that lots of other philosophers have thought that they have to have. It doesn't require that explanations be unified or simple or anything like that. The account is also minimalist in another sense, and this is going to be, I think, a little bit more controversial. I talked a moment ago about dependency relations. I think the crucial thing in a successful explanation is that it gets the dependency relations right, and this is something that kind of falls out rather naturally from the picture of explanation that I have. I think it matters a lot less that a successful explanation gets the ontology right. So here's a very simple, motivating example. It was known to the ancient Greeks that substances in willow bark cured headaches. So they understood a dependency relation there. The substance in willow bark is the material that we've now isolated and call aspirin. But of course, the ancient Greeks didn't know anything about that. They didn't know what the active ingredient was or anything like that. So in a sense, they didn't have the right ontology or the right story about the causal relata, but they did get a dependency relation right. And one of the things I want to emphasize is the relative independence of information about dependency relations from information about the ontology. I think you see this, for example, in the fact that you can have alternative formulations of theories that are treated, at least by physicists, as equivalent to one another. They can agree about the dependency relations, but they may posit very different relata, or they may be associated with very different interpretations. So the Schrödinger picture and the Heisenberg picture agree in some sense about the dependency relations, but of course the underlying pictures are quite different. I think the explanatory import or work that those frameworks can do has to do with their correct isolation of dependency relations rather than their correct views about ontology. So, saying this slightly differently, getting the ontology right is not central to explanation. And I think this fits rather naturally with the idea that ontologies can sometimes change radically across theory change, even when there's considerable preservation of the dependency relations. So Newtonian gravitational theory gets the effective dependency relations right, or approximately right, in weak gravity regimes. General relativity preserves these Newtonian dependency relations up at least to a very high degree of approximations, even though the fundamental ontology changes from Newtonian forces as responsible for gravity to an understanding of gravity in terms of space-time curvature. So the ontology changes, but there's considerable continuity in the dependency relations. This is an idea, of course, that you find emphasized in so-called structural realism, which I'm obviously at least somewhat sympathetic to. So I now want to say a little bit about inference to the best explanation, because this is part of my picture of how explanation does and does not figure inquiry. So I want to draw out the implications of what I just said about explanation for so-called IBE. And I'm going to understand IBE as the claim that the fact that some hypothesis H would, if true, provide a better explanation of some observed outcome than alternative hypotheses is a reason to believe that H is true. In other words, the potential explanatoriness of H, if true, is a reason for belief in H. And I'm going to suggest that unlike a number of other accounts of explanation, the W account does not support the legitimacy of IBE, and I think that's the correct assessment of IBE. Other accounts of explanation, particularly accounts that emphasize unification, I think naturally get connected to IBE. So my picture is this: the discovery of possible explanations belongs to the context of pursuit, as it's sometimes called, rather than the context of acceptance. The role of explanation in scientific theorizing does mean that an important part of inquiry is generating potential explanations and then exploring them testing them, developing them, etc. But the fact that you've invented a really good potential explanation, in the sense that if it were true, it would be a great explanation, doesn't mean by itself that that's a reason for accepting it as true. Instead, there has to be, in some sense, independent warrant, independent empirical evidence that supports the explanation in question before you can accept it. And I think in the ideal case, and I expect some of you will disagree with me about this, what you're really trying to get at is something like a kind of eliminative induction, in which you rule out all the competing potential explanations of the phenomena that you're interested in, save one, and then you can infer to the correctness of that explanation. You can think of this as inference to the only explanation, or the only explanation that is consistent with the empirical evidence, rather than inference to the best explanation. So that's what inference to the only explanation involves, but there is an additional assumption here, which I think is relevant to thinking about realism. Even if you're going to use IOE, you are assuming that there's some explanation or other of the phenomena that you're interested in, and that at least in principle, it ought to be possible to discover that explanation. So that's the way in which, according to me, explanation enters into the picture, not as evidence for the truth of claims, but in this other way that I've described. I'm going to skip over this. So I've given you a picture in which explanation has this role as an independent goal, and I've also expressed some skepticism about inference to the best explanation. Now let me try to say a little bit more to motivate that skepticism about IBE, and I will do this via an analogy with prediction. So finding hypotheses that are successfully predictive is, of course, a goal of science. It's one that's distinct from explanation. And, of course, a necessary condition that a predictive hypothesis is good is that it makes at least somewhat accurate predictions. But we can also evaluate predictive hypotheses along other dimensions. We can evaluate them in terms of how good or valuable they would be if they were accurate. So, for example, the fact that a proposed predictive hypothesis makes highly specific predictions, as opposed to some alternative hypothesis that makes much vaguer predictions. That's a feature of the more specifically predictive hypothesis that is more valuable. A hypothesis that, in order to make predictions, requires very little input information is, in that sense, more valuable than a hypothesis that requires a whole lot of input information that is hard to get if it's to make specific, if it's to make successful predictions. So we can evaluate predictive hypotheses in terms of how good they would be if they were to predict accurately, but that dimension of evaluation is no argument at all that the hypotheses in question in fact predict accurately. That's a different kind of question. If you thought that was true, you would be engaged in something like inference to the best predictor, in analogy with IBE. So prediction is an explanation, but I think a similar point holds about explanation. The fact that an explanation would, if true, be a really excellent explanation is a very good reason to explore that hypothesis, to test it against alternatives, etc. But it's not by itself for a reason for accepting or believing the hypothesis in question. Another way of putting the point is that, as the prediction analogy shows, hypotheses can have potential informational value, in the sense that if true or accurate, they would tell us stuff we would like to know, but the presence of that potential informational value is not a reason for think that the hypotheses in question are true. So that's a kind of warm-up to make you a little bit skeptical in terms of this analogy about IBE. What does the W account of explanation imply about IBE? Well, as I see it, the W account licenses certain kinds of comparisons among potential explanations, but not others. And in particular, it doesn't license the kind of comparisons that are required to really get IBE to work. So here are some comparisons that the W account does license. You might have a potential explanation EX1 that if true, would answer some set of questions about what would happen under various conditions. You might have another explanation, potential explanation EX2, that if true, would answer some superset of the questions that are answered by W1. There then will be an obvious and trivial sense in which the EX2 explanation gives you more information that is explanatorily relevant. So an obvious illustration of this is to think in terms of the relationship between Newtonian gravitational theory and GR. GR, you might think, answers all the W questions that Newtonian gravitational theory answers, and it answers more besides. Another possibility is you have a potential explanation EX1 that, if true, would explain some rather qualitative or coarse-grained set of facts. EX2, by contrast, explains features about the behavior of the same system, but it gives you a much more quantitative or fine-grained explanation. There's an obvious sense in which EX2 is providing you with more, as it were, explanatory value than E1. And there are other possibilities you can think of also. Now, in each of the cases that I described, the EX2s would, if true, be more informative, but I'm claiming that that's not a reason for thinking that by itself, a reason to think that the EX2s are correct. I want to emphasize, though, another feature of this account. According to the account, the EX1s, the ones that have, as it were, less explanatory scope, are, on my way of thinking about explanation, they're genuine explanations. So, for example, on the what if things had been different account, hypothesis, which is a good approximation or effective within a domain, can be used to explain, even if there's a successor theory which is even more accurate or has greater scope. The existence of the successor theory doesn't undermine the explanatory status of its predecessor. And of course, this is a consequence that believers in IBE should want to accept. That if you look at the literature in IBE, they certainly do think of, for example, of Newtonian gravitational theory as a paradigm example of the application of IBE. I think there's actually an internal problem here with inference to the best explanation, because if GR provides better explanations, then it seems like you should infer to, via IBE, you should infer to GR and reject Newtonian gravitational theory, and of course they don't want to do that, but I'm going to skip over that difficulty. So we're going to find cases in which an account of explanation which is combined with IBE will license inferences which the W account wouldn't license. We're going to have to look elsewhere, and I want to look quickly at two possibilities here, just to kind of give you a little bit more of a sense of what I understand the W account to be committed to. So here are two things you find in the literature on inference to the best explanation. You should infer to explanations that are simpler, other things being equal, and you should infer to explanations that are more unified. Both of these are so-called explanatory virtues. So let's look first at simplicity as an explanatory virtue. And here I'm going to just use this little toy model that comes out of the causal modeling literature. Suppose we have two variables, x and y. We have evidence E that they're correlated, and this is all of our relevant evidence. Suppose we can eliminate the possibility that y causes x, and consider the following two candidate explanations for E, the correlation. One, H1, just says that x causes y. The second, H2, says there's a third variable, z, which is a common cause of x and y. Let's assume that these are mutually exclusive, H1 and H2, and they're exhaustive, and that both fully account for the correlation between x and y. So here, diagrammatically, is what H1 and H2 say. If simplicity means anything very definite, you would think that H2 is less simple than H1. H2 postulates an additional variable and two causal connections, where H1 postulates just two variables and one causal connection. Thus, insofar as simplicity is an explanatory virtue, and simpler explanations are better explanations, and if we want to use IBE, we should conclude that on the basis of IBE that H1 is, first of all, the better explanation of E, and second, to the extent that we accept IBE, we should agree that we have reasons to believe H1 rather than H2. Now, I think this is very strongly at odds with good scientific practice, at least in the areas of science which I'm most familiar with, which are not physics, but more social science kinds of things. Standard scientific practice is that if our present evidence is just E, we have to take seriously the possibility that there's that third confounding variable there, and we have to take steps in one way or another to rule out that possibility. We can't just infer to H1 on the grounds that it's simpler. So no one, I think, in the causal modeling literature or the literature that makes inferences from statistical data and so on would accept the idea that you can just automatically infer to H1. The W account doesn't support the conclusion that H1 is a better explanation than H2. By hypothesis, I assume that both fully account for the correlation between X and Y. And so from the point of view of the idea that explanation is a matter of finding what things depend on what, they're both equally good from that point of view. So the W account doesn't support the idea that you should prefer H1 to H2. So that illustrates one way in which the W account is different from a standard assumption about explanation, namely that simpler explanations are always better. A similar conclusion follows from the suggestion that unification is an explanatory virtue. So suppose now we're comparing these two hypotheses, H2 and H3. H2 is just what it was before. There's a correlation between X and Y. The proposal is that there's a common cause, Z, that accounts for the correlation. H3 says, in fact, that there are two common causes that together account for the correlation. By any reasonable standard of unification, I think that H2 here is more unified than H3. H2 postulates one cause, where H3 postulates two. I think this is a conclusion that would be reached by the standard treatments of unification as an explanatory virtue in the literature, Friedman and Kitcher and so on and so forth. But I take it, the W account, again, doesn't support this assessment. And I think intuitively it's dubious that H2, if true, would provide a better explanation than H3 if H3 were to be true. And I also think it would be highly problematic to infer on the grounds of the claim that H2 provides better explanations that it's more likely to be true. So why is it that people are attracted to IBE? Well, I think one consideration that motivates them is a certain picture of science. The idea is something like this, that at any given moment, perhaps always, we have a very large number of different hypotheses and theories which are consistent with all the evidence we have at present about the behavior of some system, maybe all the evidence we can get within any reasonable amount of time in the future. So if that's the case, then it seems as though we face a massive underdetermination problem, and we have to look to so-called non-empirical virtues to solve the problem in question. And that's where I think inference to the best explanation comes into the picture. It's one of the more explanatory powers, one of the more obvious candidates for a non-empirical virtue that could guide theory choice. I think this is a distorted picture of our epistemic situation. I think, in fact, we're often in a position that gets evidence that rules out all but one of the competing explanations without relying on anything like IBE type considerations. And I think although we're able to distinguish hypotheses that are potentially explanatory from those that are not, we're rarely in a position to engage in the kind of ranking of the explanatory strengths of potential explanations that IBE would require. Now, why believe that this possibility of ruling out alternatives on on empirical grounds is at least sometimes a reasonable goal? Well, for one thing, this is common to many, many different theories of confirmation out there. If the undermining takes the form of evidence that is deductively inconsistent with the alternative hypotheses, then you can just infer the correct one via disjunctive syllogism. If you're some sort of Bayesian, you can think of this as basically implementing the same idea. This is an idea that John Ehrman emphasized long ago, that Bayesianism is really just eliminative induction in a probabilistic framework. One finds similar ideas in more recent developments in statistical learning theory. Assuming that we are choosing among candidates for effective theories, we're restricted in that way, and we're just looking at dependency relations. That helps a lot with the underdetermination problems. In other words, if the alternative theories among which we must choose are effective theories, then it's much easier to see how we can how we can rule out, sometimes we can rule out all of them but one, where again what we're ruling out is alternative theories that claim that there's some alternative set of dependency relations in some restricted domain. And this is particularly true if we think that the real goal, at least as far as finding explanations, is finding the correct dependency relations rather than the fundamental ontology of some domain of interest. And I think, in fact, it's often just an empirical fact that we are, at least sometimes, in situations in which there are known alternatives to currently accepted theories that are consistent with the evidence when those theories are understood in the effective way that I've described above. So the kind of situation that the advocate of underdetermination is talking about, I don't think you actually see that all that much in science. And of course, there's lots of cases of so-called transient underdetermination, or cases in which it may be very difficult to get the discriminating evidence. But the idea that we're continually faced with this drastic and radical underdetermination problem, if that was correct as an empirical description of science, then you would think that that's what you would actually see. And you would see scientists relying very, very heavily on these so-called non-empirical virtues to make choices among hypotheses. And I suggest that at least in many domains of inquiry, that's just not what things look like as an empirical fact. Final consideration here, philosophical folklore to the contrary. It's sometimes possible to systematically generate a whole set of alternative hypotheses that can be plausibly taken to be exhaustive. And again, we're exhaustive, that is, within some domain of inquiry, within some domain of application. So we're thinking about alternative hypotheses that are effective hypotheses within that domain. Sometimes it's possible to generate these alternatives and to search systematically through them. Examples, use of the parameterized post-Newtonian formalism to search among alternative gravitational theories. Machine learning of causal relations proceeds in this way. You just generate all of the alternatives that are consistent with the variable set that you have, and then you try to use statistical evidence and other principles to search through that space in a disciplined and efficient way. Much more locally, use of randomization and experimental design is a way of eliminating alternative hypotheses through the design of the experiment itself, rather than explicitly considering the alternatives. So here's my conclusion, interim conclusion. To the extent that such eliminative strategies are available, we don't need IBE or an account of explanation that supports IBE. Now, let me turn now quickly to some implications for scientific realism. Obviously, many arguments for scientific realism appeal to explanatory considerations, which, for example, what is explained as something like the success of science in general or the success of some particular theory. And often, they really rely on some form of IBE. So, for example, we might think of a wholesale virtue of this, a wholesale version of this as something like this: realism is the best explanation for the success of science, therefore realism is true. That's a IBE type inference. Or we might have a more retail version focused on a specific theory. Theory T is highly successful. The best explanation for the success of T is that it's true, therefore T is true. I'm going to put aside the wholesale argument, but I'll come back to it at the very end of the talk. And let's focus on the retail argument. So what does success here mean? The success is supposed to be that the best explanation of the success of theory T is that theory T is true. Success might mean that theory T successfully explains various phenomena. But that would be circular if you're trying to run an argument for realism. At least according to what I said earlier, we have to know whether T has these truth-like virtues of at least something like approximate truth before we can know whether it explains. And the truth-likeness of T is just what it is that we're trying to establish. So alternatively, let's take T's success to mean something like T's predictive success, or maybe even T's potential explanatoriness of its predictive success. That's kind of a mouthful. So the idea would be that if T were true, that would be the best explanation of its predictive success, therefore T is true. But if my previous discussion's on the right track, this is a defective argument because simply from T's predictive success, that by itself tells us nothing about whether there might be some alternative theory out there that also shares T's predictive success. To infer to the truth of T, we have to be able to eliminate that possibility, and that's just the eliminative argument that I described earlier. So there's no argument here that seems to go through inference to the best explanation or, in general, explanatory considerations for realism. And you get the same result if you claim, as sometimes people do, that realism is the only explanation for the success of T. Putnam says stuff like this, for example. Of course, if you could establish that T was the only explanation, and if you're willing to accept that there's some explanation for the success of T, then you would have an argument for the truth of T. But showing that T is the only explanation requires precisely the kind of eliminative evidence that I was talking about earlier. And so again, it's not clear that you need the explanation step here. I'm going to skip over this part, which is has to do with some of the puzzles that attend this whole notion of explaining success. And I just want to conclude with a couple of brief remarks about the implications of this, and also what we should think about the wholesale argument for realism. So what I conclude is that to the extent that there's an argument for accepting some form of realism, it's just going to have to be grounded in the kind of empirical-based eliminative strategy that I was talking about above. Can't be grounded in any form of IBE or even IOE. This just strikes me as sort of scientific common sense. And we can end up here, if we can satisfy the requirements of the eliminative argument, with specific realist claims that are worthy of acceptance. But probably what we're going to end up accepting is a good deal weaker in many cases than what realists want. We're going to end up accepting things like the dependency relations postulated by T are truth-like or approximately correct within some domain of application, and nothing more. And that is certainly less than what many realists want. So finally, let me return to the wholesale argument. And think of it this way. Suppose some theory T, or a whole collection of them, satisfies the eliminative requirements that I've been talking about. T would, if true, explain all of the explananda within its domain of application. And moreover, we have reason to think that all the alternatives to T have been excluded by the evidence. Now consider a researcher who responds to all of this in the following way. The researcher says we need not accept the claim that T is true or explanatory. The motivation of the researcher might be something like, it's not part of the goal of science to explain it all. The researcher might think that the explanation postulated by T involves unobservables, and it's not a legitimate part of science to countenance unobservables, etc. What should we think about this? I think that in this case, the researcher doesn't have to claim positively that the success of T is a miracle. Rather, the researcher is basically just saying the success of T is it's just kind of off the table. It's not something that you need to try to explain. The researcher that I'm imagining says the predictions of T all obtain, but there is and can be no explanation for why this is the case, either via T or via any alternative theory. Now, I don't think there's really anything inconsistent in this response, but I take it, and this is my reaction, that there's something deeply unsatisfying about this response. And I think that to the extent that there's any real force or content to what I've called the wholesale argument for realism, it really draws on this reaction. In other words, what it's really getting at is we think that it's kind of unacceptable, or at least kind of disappointing to say that generically there's no explanation, and there's no part of the business of science to try to explain, etc. And I think in this connection, it's no accident that non-realists like von Frossen, for example, reject the idea that explanation, at least in anything like the sense under discussion, is a goal of science. His anti-realism and his anti-explanationism, as I see it, go together. Now note, though, that this isn't an argument that any particular theory is truth-like. Again, as I emphasized, to establish anything like that, we need something more like the eliminative argument that I was talking about earlier. So I'll stop at this point and thank you for listening.
Hi Jim, thanks for the talk. I really appreciate the stuff on ID. I'm not going to be asking about that, but I'm going to be asking about the general idea that what matters for explanation is just the dependency relations and not the ontology that goes with it. So here's a situation which you're probably familiar with, which seems to buck that ideal. So I'm just curious what you think of it. So you're no doubt familiar with the double slit experiment, right? And you know, the big explanatory question that arises there is, why is there an interference pattern when there's one particle passing through these double slits at once? And standard quantum mechanics is just a kind of algorithm for prediction, but it can certainly tell us about dependencies. It can tell you that, look, if you put the electron gun closer to the double slits, or if you widen the slits, or so on and so forth. So it gets the dependencies right, but I don't know anybody that thinks that that's an explanation of why we can get an interference pattern when there's one particle going through it. It seems here, now Laura, contain yourself, when something like Bohm's theory is used, right, there's a nice story there, there's a guiding wave, right, that creates this interference pattern. So I'm just, what's your take on a situation like that? How does that fit into your view?
Well, I guess I just think that by invoking Bohm's theory, you sort of confirmed my point that this is a kind of unhelpful ontologizing. I don't see what explaining the interference pattern could possibly consist in than giving information about what the dependence pattern depends upon, which is what quantum mechanics tells you. And if you're asking for something more, then I'm going to wonder what that is. And if the something more is something like Bohmian mechanics, then I'm going to be very skeptical about that as an adequate explanatory theory.
This question is going to be very general and probably too general. I want to offer a reaction and see how you
Okay.
I fully buy all the critical parts toward IBE and the realism and truth and so on. So I'm with you completely. But my stating reaction is that the alternative is you're offering is very thin. So
Yep.
Too thin to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that one can completely buy your critical part, but yet have a little bit more than just the dependency relations.
Okay.
In terms of, it seemed to me that what the theory offers to me, it's a set of concepts, of notions that allow me to think about what I want to call reality, which tells me that within some approximation regime, etc., well, those notions are powerful for thinking about reality in those terms. Field, a force, a correlation, whatever. And the power of this theory is not just of course, the confirmation of the theory, the reason to believe, etc., but the power of the theory is this extra structure, which is a conceptual structure, and is actually what I call my access to reality. This doesn't imply at all that there isn't a better one, perhaps completely that there couldn't be a better one completely different, but it gives me a grasp of reality. Oh, there are forces. Well, maybe there is a better way of thinking. There is a field that is much thicker, and I use when I do explanations.
Mm-hmm.
Your single example, you put the first one, Brownian motion. It's almost coming to. I can think that there are actual little things bouncing around. I have a very thick a picture of reality. I don't have to take it neither ultimate nor the final. I can interpret this as a tool for dot dot dot. I'll let you comment.
Oh, well, that's a very, I mean, those are very good questions. And I am aware of the fact or the possibility that I'm dismissing the ontology or something like the ontology a little too quickly. But I wonder what you do with cases in which you have alternative theories that are generally thought to be equivalent, at least from a physicist's point of view, but they're associated with different, whatever you want to call them, the kinds of pictures that are different in the way that you, the different pictures, but they're pictures in the way that you describe.
Well, Feynman gave us a wonderful answer to that, right? He said that every good physicist, to quote it, knows more than one way of thinking about a phenomenon, and keep them in mind, careful, because he doesn't know which one of it will be good when learning more. So it's a remarkable situation because you don't buy any of them for your knowledge of reality, but you buy each one of them for some knowledge you have about reality, and in fact you don't consider all equal because maybe someone is going to be more. So what I know is that reality could be described in the way A, the way B, the way C. That's information about reality. And maybe tomorrow I'll find one of them to be better or not.
Okay.
But that's still information about it.
Okay, well that's, yeah, I mean, maybe the right way to think about this is in terms of something like an equivalence class of ontologies or something like that are useful. And that the fact that there is an equivalence class that's limited in some way, that, as you say, that's useful information. That is telling you something about, yeah, no, thank you, that's a very useful suggestion.
Thanks. So I was going to point out a really interesting parallel to Peirce's sort of dismay with what we might call inference-to best explanation.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you. Can you talk a little more into the mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So Peirce also expresses some dismay about assuming that you can use inference to best explanation.
Yeah.
And his concern with it, he shares your conclusion, but his concern with it, I think, might also apply to some of the stuff that you were talking about. So I was just going to float that. So part of what he says is that you have to assume in order to use it that there's a certain kind of, I can't remember the phrase that he uses, like consonance between what the possibilities in the world are and what possibilities you came up with, such that you can, use the possibilities that you came up with as a guide towards finding what there is in the world. And you were listing the things that were sort of going to work, including things like automated learning algorithms for searching the space of possible DAGs to find the DAG that goes with a certain kind of, I don't know, like some sort of data set. And one of the problems with that is that sometimes you end up having not gotten the correct DAG in the original search space. And so then you can't use any kind of inference to the only explanation because you presuppose that maybe it was acyclic or that there weren't any causal faithfulness violations or anything like this. So there's still a kind of like, you still have to have a kind of consonance in the original search space that you're using of what the possible DAGs are before you can then say, oh, and we've eliminated all of them to find the correct one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you say is correct, but in principle, of course, the search space can't be completely unlimited, right? So, yeah, so if you're searching for the correct DAG using some of the familiar algorithms that we know about, yeah, you make certain assumptions about the, you do typically assume that this structure is acyclic. You do typically assume that various assumptions relating the structure of the DAG to the probability distribution are satisfied. So yeah, it's a circumscribed search, but that, I mean, what's the alternative? You can't, you're asking for something that I mean, it can't just be an objection carte
no.
blanche, that the search space is limited, and there are ways of systematically generating search spaces and searching through them. This is, in another area in which this is done is molecular biology, where you.
Yes, but there's a lot of ways in which the researchers have actually developed techniques, because it's not unusual for you to end up having accidentally not gotten the correct one in your initial search space. So it's, in that sense, not like a sort of long distant possibility. It's something that people in some of these fields are actually trying to take into account, because it happens so often that you accidentally had something that was cyclic, there was a cycle in there, or there was some sort of triangle violation or something like this. So in that sense, I'm not saying that we should defend IDE, just that the IOE also falls prey to some of these same problems. We have to assume that you got the right answer in there. And it's not an in-principle theoretical thing. It's sort of much more live in how people are dealing with it.
Okay, I mean, I guess, one issue here is how do we, so the way in which people have thought about scientific realism, or, concluding that some theory is approximately true or something like that, is they want to put aside sort of various kinds of radically skeptical scenarios. It can't just be that you're not entitled to belief in the correctness of Newtonian gravitational theory in its domain of application, merely because, for all we know, there's some alternative out there that no one has ever thought of. So, to the extent that the kind of scenario you're talking about implicates a kind of, sort of systematic doubt of, for all we know, there might be some alternative out there. I guess I'm not convinced. It looks like we're in a.
I'm pointing at something much more concrete. So, like, people at SFU in the biomedical physiology and kinesiology department are having a hard time implementing use of these search techniques, because they so often have cycles, and they've had so many times where people were like, my data structure just doesn't work for this kind of thing. So it's not like a far off hypothetical skepticism. It's so live that there's a couple of people who decided not to do it.
Well, I think maybe the point of the example about the search algorithms in causal learning was just to illustrate the point that systematic search through a set of alternatives is often possible, and you can generate the alternatives. If you're using the algorithms on a data set in which the assumptions on which the algorithms are based are not satisfied, then of course it's not going to give you correct. So this wasn't a kind of defense of these causal search algorithms in all applications or something like that. I was just trying to, this is one of many illustrations of this idea of systematically ruling out alternatives. And I was just claiming that you can sometimes do it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I am certain that I've missed something, but I hope this will be informative for you to tell me what. So when you bring up the notion of the only explanation and ruling out all alternatives, I can't see how we're eliminating alternatives that nobody in science would ever suggest but seem just ineliminable. So I'm thinking like Cartesian demon scenarios where I'm not deceived about reality, but a demon has just put the data in there to be a very particular way. It just doesn't seem like these are eliminable as an explanation of the data. I mean, surely if that were the case, the data would all be as it is.
I wouldn't regard those as explanations to begin with. They're not even potential explanations from my point of view. So that's the way I would respond to that.
Yeah, so Ken has a follow-up on Cartesian.
Oh, it's not a follow-up.
Oh, okay, so sorry. I'll have you in the queue. Come here? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. I mean, you said you wanted some pushback, so maybe I'll
Yeah, sure.
give some. And I mean, this is just on your kind of W concept explanation, and might be not surprising, but Yeah, I mean, any kind of infinitary account of explanation I'm always a bit worried about. So here's a class of explanations which I think are not captured by dependency relations, and I would like to hear what you think. So explanations which are historicist in some sense. These do not have to be explanations in history, but explanations which involve some kind of historical trajectory. So here's a why question. Why is Mies van Rohe's buildings famous, and why are they famous? Why are they important for architecture? The explanation for such questions are not captured by dependency relations. Or another question, maybe which is not a why question, is how did medieval monks make blue pigment for stained glass windows? That's a scientific explanation that calls for a scientific explanation, but it seems that unless and until you give a historical trajectory about that they got this pigments from these kind of minerals, and you can't explain the whole story about why blue pigments were, or like purple pigment was important for medieval monks.
Well,
So what I'm saying is that maybe dependency relations sometimes do not capture everything that we want from an explanation. They might capture very good aspects, but they might not be the whole story. So that's my pushback. Yeah.
well, let me say a bit about my general attitude toward this, and then I'll respond specifically to your question. So the word explanation is, of course, used in a huge variety of different ways, both in English and in science. And some people have aimed at a so-called theory of explanation that's going to encompass all of those uses. I think that the attempt to do this has generally turned out to be a disaster, because the notion that you end up with just has no teeth at all. It can't be used for any useful purpose. So you have to be more discriminating. And if you like, you can say that I'm talking about a particular kind of explanation and the way that it figures as a goal in science. And I'm not saying much about the other kinds of ways in which you might want to use the word explanation. As far as your examples go, so why are Mies van der Rohe buildings famous? It's not a terribly well-defined question, but I would have thought that the correct story would be something like, how did the buildings somehow come about to capture the public imagination in the way that they do? And there's a story there that would be very intricate but would depend upon dependency relations and the transmission of opinions among elite architectural critics and transmission of opinions among ordinary people and so on and so forth. So it'd be very, very complicated, but I think it still would involve dependency relations to some considerable extent.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the dependencies instead of ontology approach. So one virtue of focusing on the dependencies is that you're going to avoid these worries about whether you're getting the ontology right, especially as you're changing theories. But I'm wondering whether or how exactly it actually helps, because I'm not sure how separable ontology
Yeah.
dependencies are. So as you know, one reason to introduce unobservables is to enable us to talk about dependencies that we couldn't otherwise talk about. But when we do that, we're not just monotonically increasing the number of dependencies that we can talk about, right? Because we can also say that some of the dependencies we thought we had before aren't actually dependencies, or they failed. We can explain why they failed when they did, whereas we couldn't before. So I think what you said during the talk was that superseded theory still explains. The example you gave is Newtonian physics. That still gives explanations, even in cases where it gets a dependency problem, right? So that would mean that we do get a monotonic increase in explanatory power, and so that looks like we've solved that problem. But now, and this is the question, I don't see what specifically focusing on dependencies is allowing us to do here, because it seems like we could just say, well, the previous theories also got something right about the ontology, even in the cases where they got something wrong about the ontology too. So I'm wondering what exactly is focusing on dependencies doing here?
Yeah, I guess my question would be, and I'd like to hear more about this, how are you going to describe what the previous theory got right about the ontology? And Professor Rovelli made some suggestions about that I'm going to have to think about. But my initial starting point was that, force and space-time curvature seem like really quite different notions. And so the sense in which, from the perspective of GR, Newton got something right about the ontology, at the very least it requires some articulation.
But the dependencies don't require articulation in the same way?
Well, I think that's, in some sense, in some obvious sense, the dependency relations, like just what would happen, if the gravitational force were to increase, or if this planet were to be further away, et cetera, within the domain of application of the Newtonian theory, that's what doesn't change when you move to when you move to GR.
Thanks, Jim. I really enjoyed your talk. I have two questions. One is, when I listened to your talk, I just removed the word explanation and just thought of you talking about dependencies. And so my first question is, did I lose anything in understanding your arguments or your talk by removing this explanation, which seems to me something philosophers stick in that doesn't really help us understand the science. The second question is, if we just think in terms of dependencies, aren't there lots of dependencies?
Oh, yeah.
So what does it even mean to say inference to the only dependency? Because there are many, and in the practice of, say, molecular biology, they're trying to rule out some dependencies, but not all dependencies. That wouldn't be a practical or useful thing to do.
Well, first, to reply to the second part of your question, of course, what is meant is you have some fixed target set of phenomena, and what you're inferring to is the only explanation for those target set of phenomena. If you shift the target set of phenomena, then another set of dependency relations are going to be relevant. So I guess the question that I have is, when you say there's all these different dependency relations out there, but do you mean that there's a theory that says if you wiggle X in such a way, Y will change in a certain way, and a second theory that says if you wiggle X in such a way, Y will change in a really quite different way, and they're both correct? I find that a little hard to accept.
No, it's wiggle Z.
What?
Wiggle Z, and then you would get another difference. So
you mean that there's, okay, but that's so if what you're interested in is explaining the state of Y, okay, and it turns out that wiggling X changes the state of Y and wiggling Z changes the state of Y, then they both should be in your complete account of dependency relations.
And this is why I asked two questions, and you took them in the opposite order.
Okay.
Because if one thinks of dependencies as being important because one has a goal of manipulating,
Yeah, that's one reason. Yeah.
then you could do it by wiggling X, or you could do it by wiggling Z, and either one would be fine. So it wouldn't be an inference to the only wiggling. It would.
No, but the explanation, when you infer to the only explanation, you have all of the ideal is you've identified something like all of the factors on which the explanatum of interest depends, and if there's several of them, then you do that. But it's also, I think we're maybe a little bit at cross purposes here, because it's not as though if you infer that x, wiggling x will change y, it's not as though that's in any way inconsistent with inferring that wiggling z will change y, or that wiggling either x or z will change y. These are all within the kind of framework that I'm talking about. These are all acceptable inferences.
I noticed when you're answering and you're sneaking in the E word, and you're talking about explanation, and I think that that is doing some work. If the interest really isn't dependencies, I don't think that inference to the only dependency makes sense.
Well, it's okay. All right. Well, maybe that's a reason why thinking about this in terms of explanation is actually superior, because you do want some. I mean, of course, lots of things don't depend on only one other thing, and it was never. I didn't formulate the view as inference to the only dependency relation, right? I mean, that wasn't what I was at all what I was trying to suggest. It's something, I think biology and physics are very, very different in this respect. But if you have a whole lot of dependency relations involving different factors, different ways in which some outcome can come about, then I'm not really sure exactly what it is that we're disagreeing about, because it's not part of my view that in that kind of case you would somehow make it part of this framework that I'm defending, that you infer to only one of those dependency relations and say that the others are irrelevant or something like that.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to cut off the discussion here. Let's thank Jim.